back up a little bit just to kind of review a little bit of what we kind of talked about last time. To give you, well, first of all, I just want to comment on the slide. I've been putting up a different artwork of David.
That's a fantastic one.
This is actually my favorite. I had, Michelangelo's David, which is of course the classic one last time.
I prefer this one.
I do as well. One of the things that's... The detail is incredible, but it's also mid-action.
Instead of static, like so many are from that era.
Yes. Well, I was about to mention one of the other ones, but we'll get to that one. But look at the expression on his face.
Yeah.
He is ready to do something. This is in Rome, the museum in Rome. So this is how I've kind of got this set up. And I don't always follow this strictly, but the idea is that last time we kind of talked about, is it still a little?
Oh, no.
Okay, we're good?
It's just when I thought of David, I've always thought between young David and King David as David the soldier, David the best friend, David the betrayer.
Yeah.
And that's the part that in many ways speaks to our own failures.
Yes.
So,
And that's kind of covered in between, but, we can't cover it all, so we kind of choose what we do. And young David is really what I kind of meant by that. But we didn't get as far as I thought last time, so we'll see where we get this time. But last time we talked about who David is, and kind of looked at the fact that what we know about David is from the Bible. There are not a lot of references to David outside of the Bible. And so it kind of raises the question, how accurate is that portrayal? We did talk about a couple very, very small references. I'll let you look at that on the video, which may be useful or may not be. But it's certainly possible that what we know of David was a much later
interpretation.
Well, not only interpretation, but was written the way it was written for a purpose.
As many of the books are.
As many of the books are, absolutely. Hello.
Is this the King David?
That's right, yes,
All right.
welcome. I'm Paul.
Hi, Paul. I'm Natalie.
Natalie.
And Tara.
Hi, Tara.
So I'm just kind of reviewing a little bit because there was a class last week and just kind of what I was talking about
Okay.
last week a little bit. So last week I was just kind of introducing David, and talking about the first references in the Bible to David. Oh, hey.
Sorry to be late.
No, not
I
good.
made it last week.
It is on the internet if you're interested.
Okay.
I didn't do a great job with the camera, so you can't see the board too well, but you can hear everything.
That's okay.
So if you go to the St. Andrew Lutheran website, there's an
Okay.
education link.
Yeah.
And if you click on that, there's an adult education, and then it should be pretty close
On
to
there,
the top
okay.
on there. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
And so, we looked at some of the first Bible passages that talked about David, introduced him, and then, like I say, looked a little bit at what was outside of the Bible, which isn't much. Propaganda was the word I was looking for. There may have been a lot of propaganda in terms of how David is portrayed, because what we have written was certainly written well after David lived. And so it was important for the Jews to try to portray themselves as being part of a long line of important people. And that may not have been exactly right. We don't know for sure. But we think of David as a king. He may have been more of a chieftain. We just don't know
In more
it.
of a tribal sense.
In more of a tribal sense, exactly right. So today we want to kind of get to where the Bible talks about him slaying Goliath and then going on from there to some of the areas we were talking about today. So
And it was Samuel who was a judge,
that's right.
and Saul was the first king,
That's right.
and then David came after Saul.
Yes, it gets a little confusing there in terms of, you'll often see David as the second king. But he was the second king of Judah, not the second king of Israel.
Oh, okay.
So there is another king that followed Saul in Israel.
Oh, Saul was the king of both?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
But I mean, it's kind of confusing because the territory was shifting. So, what does that mean exactly?
Okay.
Hello.
Sorry,
No problem.
stress as I could get here.
No, it was kind of a late service today, so
Yes.
we went in. So I'm not going to review everything, so we're just going to have to catch up here. So what I'd like to do is do some readings this morning, and we'll make some comments on those. So would you mind reading from me?
Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servants said to him, "See now, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the evil spirit of God is upon you, he will play it, and you will feel better." So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me someone who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a kid, and sent them by his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Saul said to Jesse, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. And Saul would be relieved and feel better, and the evil spirit would depart from him.
Okay, so last time when we were reading, we were reading about how David was anointed by Samuel. And so this is the next part after that. Now he becomes in the service of the king of Saul. So when he was anointed, that didn't mean he was instantly king.
I see.
That meant he was chosen to be king, but a period of time passes before that actually happens. And then there's a mention of Jesse. We talked about that a little bit last time. Jesse was David's father. And you run into that every once in a while with nice Christmas hymns, right? Jesse's rod and that type of thing.
Son of Jesse.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Do you mind reading?
I know. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soka.
Don't worry about
I
it.
have a hard time with the names in the Bible sometimes from the places, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 4 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze in his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me."
Excellent. So how tall was Goliath? This is one of the things that's always interesting to me.
I was going to ask you that.
10 cubits, so a cubit is this distance.
Right.
Right.
Now, if I grab one of those Bibles it will say 6 cubits.
No.
Yeah.
And-
It's different.
It is different, and so generally people say 6 cubits is 9.5 feet or something like that. So that's what I grew up with, knowing, or believing that Goliath was close to 10 feet.
What would 4 cubits be?
That's more like 6'7", 6'9".
So not really a giant, but
Well,
like a basketball player.
like a modern basketball player.
Yeah, I guess back then.
Well, there
Back
were
then.
a lot of very large tribes that were tall and brawny and, you know.
But were they
6'5"
different?
to 6'7",
Sure.
really big guys, and they would have been considered giant if you went to a place where the people averaged 5 feet to 5'5".
Yeah.
Well, and I think 5'5" would have even been tall
Pretty
in that day for the average person. Any idea why it changed? Why does this say 4 and
I like the span, 4 cubits and a span. Is that the span of your hand, like a hands of a horse?
I do not know the answer to that. I think you're probably right. I think they're trying to say, 4 cubits is here and a span adds a little bit more to it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's one thing I learned in years ago in confirmation. Span was your hand.
oh, the hand, okay, the
Was
span
your
of your
hand, but,
fingers.
you know, who knows if they were right? I'm just saying. I just
Yeah.
don't-
Well, he's carrying a lot of weight.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's no question that as the Bible is describing it, this was a big guy. But he's not 10 feet, at least according to this
Yeah,
version.
so why did it change from 6 to 4?
Anybody have any idea?
How many versions of Bibles are there, and how often did the measurements
Yeah.
change?
Well, that's a good point, although it's remarkable how consistent the 6 cubits was for years and years and years. But something happened that made us change it to 4.
Some archaeological, the defined cubit?
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, yeah. Scroll.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in like the 50s on up through the 90s. Once they found some, it took a little while for the word to get out because it was just found by somebody local who didn't really know what they had, and they tried to sell it, and there's a big whole story. It's kind of interesting. But eventually they realized there was stuff here. And so then they really did a search and they found a lot of stuff. And so the thing that's interesting is, so what was the Old Testament written in? What language? For the most part, there's a few
Hebrew.
exceptions.
Hebrew.
In Hebrew, exactly right. What's the oldest version before the Dead Sea Scrolls of an existent Hebrew text?
I don't know.
10th century.
I don't know.
Oh, that one.
So we lost any original writings in Hebrew. They're long gone until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what was handed to us were translations of Hebrew. And so one of the first things when they realized what they had here, the Dead Sea Scrolls were generally from about 2 centuries before Christ to about a century after Christ. So there's a lot of stuff they found, and it spans a pretty wide range. But it's all much earlier than what we had in original Hebrew. So when they realized, hey, we've really got some old stuff here, one of the interesting things was, they're going, well, now we get a chance to see how accurate what's been handed to us is. And so people kind of expected to find all kinds of stuff that's changed over the 10 centuries, or that changed in the translations into Greek, which is how we got a lot of it, But remarkably, that's not the case. What they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is really pretty close. Again, there's exceptions, and this is one of them. This is one where the Dead Sea Scrolls say 4 cubits, and for whatever reason, whatever we got handed down in Greek, changed it to 6 cubits. And so the Bibles that we have in the pews and that we have on that shelf there are the New Revised Standard Version. I believe I have that right. New Revised Standard Version.
And there's another translation that just came out recently.
Well, and this is that.
Oh, that's the one there, yeah.
So I use Bible Gateway for a lot of things because it allows me to copy and paste so I can make slides. It's really handy. BibleGateway.com. wonderful website. It's really neat because you can do searches. You know, if you're looking for a topic, you can search for it that way. They also have a lot of other translations. And so sometimes I find it's helpful when you get a little bit puzzled, like, hey, what does this mean? Well, look at 4 different translations. And one of them might kind of trigger something like, oh, wait, I see what they're saying, you know. Every translation is a little bit different, comes at it from a different angle. And so it's really useful. But this is my understanding what we will eventually be using. It's very expensive to replace all the Bibles, so I don't know how quickly it will happen. And there isn't a huge, you know, impetus to just swap them all out because the changes are pretty subtle. There really isn't that kind of thing where, you know, you're looking at it and going, wow, this changes my faith. You know, there really isn't that kind of a change. And that goes back to what I was saying. The Dead Sea Scrolls are pretty much dead on to what was handed down to us all those years, except for little details. There's probably some things that are a little bit bigger, but this is one of those details. And I don't know, but I just like the idea of Goliath being something I can comprehend. It just makes the whole story more accessible to me. That, you know, there are a lot of 5-foot people running around, and there was the 6'7" guy. He would have been a giant. And if he could carry this stuff, he would have been bulky too.
Yeah.
I think the coat would have been around 100 pounds. It's not impossible. You see military guys carry 100-pound packs. You know, so that is doable, but that takes a big guy. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Yeah, so, you know, you imagine like a loom, a vertical loom. They'd have this piece of wood across the top that would kind of keep the tension and the threads from tangling and that. And the reason they use that as an illustration is that would have been the longest, thickest, straightest thing that somebody of that era could imagine. And, you know, a normal spear would be a stick, you know, but this was more like a branch almost, you know, a big thing. The head of the spear was maybe like 16 pounds, so this is a big deal.
Well, by the time we put together the wood and that was probably over 50 pounds or more.
Yeah. So, you know, and of course that could have been exaggerated too. Yeah, you know, we don't know. But anyway, it gives us a little bit better of an idea. You know, I do encourage you to look at Bible Gateway and play around with that and look at the differences. It's kind of fun.
We will be starting to use this latest translation in the worship bulletins because it's available to us now through our Sundays in Season worship when it just came out.
Excellent.
Just came out.
Yeah, no, one thing I wish they had on Bible Gateway was I wish they would have kept the old version too. But they didn't. They replaced it with the new one.
Yeah.
So we can't do that head-to-head comparison online like I'd like. But
There must be some resource online you could find the original, the just previous version, I guess.
I'm sure there is. You know, it's funny. I don't quite understand how the copyrights work on all of that kind of stuff. I feel like Bible Gateway has gone through the legal channels to do it officially. But they're not as easy to find online as you would think. You know, I have never been able to find a version of the Bible on the ALCA website, for example. One would think that would be a thing, but I don't believe it is unless I've just missed it.
Some of the Bibles are copyrighted.
Well, this is the point. Yeah, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they're copyrighted. So, all right. Any other thoughts there? We can move on here. Do you mind, Susan?
If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, They were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So he's taunting them.
Yeah. I'm going to go through the next one too and then make some comments. Do you want to go?
Jesse said to his son David, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain, and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. And also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning. He left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. They came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him.
Okay, so this is starting to get a little confusing because in the previous part,
He's taunting.
no, I'm going even before that.
Okay.
David was said to be made the shield bearer for
Armor bearer.
for Saul. And now
And his
he's
name
not.
is Saul,
Yes, exactly.
and he's running back and forth to Bethlehem
Right.
to feed the sheep.
Right.
To feed the sheep.
Exactly. So that gets a little strange, and then we'll go one more, and it gets even stranger.
Okay, all the Israelites, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich the man who kills him and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel." David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." His eldest brother Eliab heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle." David said, "What have I done now? It was only a question." He turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before.
I love that. What have I done now? It was only a question. Doesn't that sound like siblings, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, teenagers, going in each other's face. Yeah, so we're still getting confused here because if he's the armor bearer, why is he being chastised for
Coming to watch the battle.
coming to watch the battle and leaving the sheep?
Yeah.
You know, so we're still getting a little confused. Let's go to the next one.
When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you."
And we'll just go ahead and finish this off here.
Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them. So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine.
A wadi is like a dry riverbed, you know, so. And one more.
The Philistine came on and drew near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. But David said to the Philistine, You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that is all this assembly may know, that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.
Yeah.
When the Philistine drew near to meet David, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and he cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The troops of Israel and Judah rose up with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. The Israelites came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent.
Go ahead.
When Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. The king said, Inquire whose son this young man is. On David's return from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite.
So how do we reconcile this with that earlier part where he was someone that, you know, was able to calm Saul and, was in his service?
Who he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's either, out of order, or in a lot of ways, people don't really pay attention to obscure maids and servants and little guys that are running around the palace, and he's brought in to play his lyre to calm Saul's with this demon in his head. And I can't
Well, this
figure
is
out
an
why
important
there's a
point.
demon in his head,
Yeah.
So why did God put the demon in his head in the first place? And then why is he so rational, going through all this saying, okay, let's go to war, I need my armor, who's you? And,
Yeah, you brought a lot to cover there. No, it's good. So the demon in the head, so one of the things that we were reading about last time was how Saul turned away from God. So God had given him very specific instructions on what to do, involving wars he was fighting and whatnot. And he failed to do it. And Samuel said, okay, you've kind of blown it here. Saul tried to ask for forgiveness, but it was too late, So there's that aspect of he's no longer favored by God, as kind of the Old Testament words would do it. But it certainly seems like there's something else even besides that going on here. Mental illness of some sort, you know, and we'll get into that more in the future. You know, bipolar, I mean, not good at analyzing these types of things, but.
I mean, they would have called that a demon because wouldn't recognize mental illness.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. So there was definitely something going on, and you know, how much of that coincides with the description of having left God's favor or whatever, you know, that's kind of up to us to decide. I think, you know, there's a couple other things in terms of why we have it written the way it is. One of the things that the Bible often does is it compresses time for the purposes of
Getting through the story.
getting through the story, right? Or you know, just telling a portion of the story.
To focus on what's important out of that.
And so when they're talking about him being the shield bearer, it doesn't necessarily mean, the
Shield bearer is very different.
how is that different? I'm curious.
The shield bearer is going to be right beside you with your shield.
And the armor,
Taking it. Armor bearer is somebody who should be putting your armor on, taking it off.
carrying and helping
Yeah,
him.
he's a nobody.
Right,
So
right,
again,
right.
that's why it doesn't bother me that Saul doesn't know who he is. It's like, okay, it's another, you know, kid helping me put my armor on and off. Like the kid who sits in that, he looks a lot like that guy with the lion, you know?
So now I'm curious. I just wanted to double check here.
Entered his service and became his armor bearer.
Armor bearer, yeah. No, you're making a good distinction that went over my head. Now, I mean, again, when we look at this, you know, there still seems to be a familiarity, and he's saying Saul sent to Jesse. So he is aware of
Father.
the father at some level.
Yeah.
And then later on, it doesn't seem like he has any clue as to who any of these people are. And so when we talk about kind of compressing time,
How many years went by?
well, this is it. We have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
They're still describing David as being young. So it can't be a lot if we're saying that these are chronological. But
An armor bearer could be 13, 14 years old.
Correct.
A young man could still be 21, 22, 23.
correct,
And they change a lot between then and there.
Well,
correct.
the lifespan was much shorter then too, so 21, 22 could be middle age.
There have been a lot of archaeological discoveries recently. A lot of places of the Bible that have actually been found, and corresponding mentions of things from Samaria and other areas. And I suspect that we'll see a lot more having to do with David also, and that line. But
In terms of archaeology,
yeah,
I mean, that's,
and in terms of things like saying, you know, did they really have that short a lifespan? Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes not. Were they that small? Not necessarily at all.
Well,
So
yeah,
the skeletons they found, so.
True.
I mean, you know, it is truly remarkable how almost nothing has been found of David.
And there's some other very important biblical characters.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah, I find that interesting too, because they should have been correspondingly mentioned in surrounding countries' history.
correct,
At least
correct.
the battles.
Correct,
Who the major
yeah.
generals were.
You know, there is that old, you know, truism that victors write the history, right?
They did.
And David won an awful lot of battles. So there weren't an awful lot of victors to write about David being defeated. You know, so that could be part of it.
That's a very good point.
Where's his writings?
Sorry?
Where are his writings?
The
Yeah,
Psalms?
yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, a lot has been attributed to David. The Psalms are a big one.
Attributed, you're right.
But, you know, remember how we talked about the Hebrew scriptures didn't last, and we had to deal with translations until we found 10 centuries later writings in Hebrew. There may be lots of things that were written about David that are just gone. You know, that are empire documents of his kingdom, you know.
What about the Greek translations? What about the translations that are really, really, really old?
Mhm.
Do we have those?
We do have Greek translations that are old. They're not contemporary,
Right.
but they're old.
I mean, how terrible is it to reverse translate to see these things?
No, and that's what we've had, and that, you know, our Bible is essentially reverse translations,
But I mean,
translated then again into English. You know, I mean, all of Christianity is based on that. So it's not like people were saying, well, we don't believe any of this stuff. I mean, you know, millions upon millions of people believe that as the scripture. But, you know, people who study this type of stuff know that when you have translations, something gets lost in the translation.
guided by personal viewpoints, no matter how unbiased you try to be.
Correct. And again, the Dead Sea Scrolls are extremely interesting because of how little that happened. It's really remarkable how close the Dead Sea Scrolls follow what has been passed down to us through these multiple translations. Not perfect, but you know, there's very little that would shake your faith if your faith is based on the scriptures. But so going back to kind of this idea of why is this feel disjointed and a little bit unusual. So it could be in that first story, they were trying to tell kind of a whole story of David, including what was going to happen in the future.
Oh, yeah.
So when they talk about him being the armor bearer, it may not be that this happened right away. It happened a long time after.
The author's ploy.
Correct.
Little did he know he would become the armor bearer to
Exactly.
Saul the king.
Yeah. And it's just not written clearly that this was something that would happen in the future. And there are definitely other cases in the Bible that are like that, where they talk about compressing time like that. Another thing we should kind of consider is, you know, we talk about books of the Bible, and our brain goes to a hardcover book that you grab off the shelf. Here's a book that somebody wrote from the first page, and they wrote it through to the end, and now it's a book. But a lot of what we have in the Bible were written as individual scrolls or manuscripts or tablets or whatever it was, and then were much later combined into a volume. And so it's possible that what we have here are a series of stories written by different hands. And so when you have a story that has a time frame and another story that overlaps with that time frame, it makes it difficult to put them in sequence because they overlap.
And rather than write them all and integrate them together, you're still left with individual stories that are a little bit offset.
Exactly. So that's definitely a possibility here that kind of explains this, that, you know, because of how we put them in 1 Samuel in the specific order, we want to read them completely linearly, but instead we should possibly read them as, here's a story, now we put that aside, now here's a different story, and there's overlapping in terms of the time period. At the end of the day, it shouldn't be that important to us. You know, the fact that we can't quite figure out what happened when is not the point of the stories.
Right.
You know, so, but I do think it's interesting, and it is something we should keep in mind when we're reading the Bible, not just this part, but other parts too. That if we start getting bogged down in the details, you know, we've now lost the big picture.
The point of the story, actually.
The whole point of the story, yeah.
So, I'm curious, we keep coming back to Jesse. Okay, so Jesse is the servant of Saul.
Yes.
And Saul knows Jesse enough to say, I want a bunch of your boys, or you have to send me your boys from my army, or whatever. Because he's got 3 sons in the army right now.
Right.
Okay,
Now, we don't know that he knows them though. I mean, it could have been just a general, everybody
Has to serve so.
has to
much
serve,
finally,
yeah.
Okay, but he knows Jesse enough to request from him specifically, David. Somebody has said, Jesse's son, David, is
Right.
going to play the lyre for you and
Right.
make you feel better. And Jesse's son is in the army and is going to be your armor bearer now, or whatever.
Right.
So, however it comes out, Saul knows Jesse, right? More than anything else.
I mean, I would say it's likely that he has heard the name. But that's not the same as knowing.
Okay, because I don't really recall Jesse being that important.
Oh, in terms of what's handed down to us. Yeah, no, for sure not. David overshadows everything.
Yeah, even his brothers. I mean, one of the versions I read when I was a kid, David's brothers were a lot meaner to him than just one line saying, you're just here to see the fight.
Yeah.
They were mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I think we have a problem with the Old Testament is, if you're like me, you went to Sunday school and you're 8 years old or 7 years old, and some poor, 6-year-old woman is trying to explain these stories to you. And if you just read it, it's a little dry for a kid. But is it truthful? I mean, is it accurate?
When I compared it to the regular Bible, the children's Bible is an illustrated children's Bible. It's beautifully plated and it makes the stories more accessible.
Correct. No argument.
Yeah, it's just great. And I read it very young. Maybe I was 5, or 4 or 5 when I was reading that. And I recall the stories blended quite nicely into the actual Bible when I was reading the real Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Fuller Bible, adult Bible. So I don't think it was inaccurate so much as it was just simplified in language that was easier for children to read.
I would push back a little bit. I would say that it is very enhanced
Really?
in terms of details. So in other words, and certainly they don't deal with these problems of chronology.
No.
They're just picking and choosing.
Yes.
It
It is a smaller version.
Correct.
Definitely.
Correct. And they will take something from this chapter and something from this chapter and from this chapter and turn it into a coherent story. But as I was saying before, that might not be terribly accurate because those were perhaps written to be individual stories. And so somebody is taking...
Conglomeration is.
Right.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Now I have to go read it again.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I find that kind of stuff really interesting and, is helpful for you to, form your own ideas of what the big picture is. But at the end of the day, it's not that important.
See, here, the thing that I find really downplayed but seems to me to be the most important is that this is the army of God, really. And God is guiding this army. And yet we just have like a couple mentions of that, and all the rest of it is just set up for the big scene where David kills Goliath.
Right.
And that kind of disturbs me.
There's a lot of, how would you say, empty writing.
Yeah, that's a really good term. Thank you for that. Explain something.
And I feel like it is the only possible reason it exists is because the readers at the time it was written down needed to feel something was bigger.
I was going to say it was written by committee.
Well, I mean, that could be too. That could be definitely true. But, if you write things very concisely and to the point, it doesn't have much gravity.
No, it's also drawn and it doesn't engage you and you won't remember it when you walk away.
Right. And so in some ways I feel like all of the text serves to whet your appetite for the meat of it. It's kind of drawing you in for the important stuff. But whether it succeeds or not is up to you. you know. Well, I hate to say it, we're kind of out of time. I don't mind talking a little bit more, but I don't like to keep people going too long on this stuff. Any other thoughts about how far we got here?
Oh, it's interesting to think about his young life.
I'm interested still, it's interesting to think about how big he actually was.
Glad?
Yeah.
Well,
I'm
because that's
stuck on
the,
that
that was the
too.
size
Yeah.
of my husband. He's 6'5".
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's just interesting to think about that back then.
I mean, this is a strange anecdote, but I lived in Buffalo for a year, Buffalo, New York.
Yeah, I've been there, yeah.
One of the things that just, I'm 6 foot even.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the big mall in Buffalo on Christmas, or right before Christmas. So it was packed to the gills. This is the old days before Amazon and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember being at one side of the mall and looking across the heads of everybody there, and I could see to the other side. And it just kind of dawned on me that people in Buffalo are short.
Really?
You go to Minnesota, it is not that way.
Yeah.
I cannot go to a mall, a crowded place, whatever it is, State Fair or whatever, and look across a crowd, because I'm looking at the back of the head of the guy who's 6'4" in front of me.
Yeah.
And so, there really are differences in heights even today,
Yeah.
based on, what part of the world people come from, and, in some cases nutrition, and there's all kinds of factors. I would guess that back then, there was even bigger differences.
Right.
And that somebody 6'7" would have been, for most people, the biggest person they've ever seen in their life.
Right.
And I don't know why, I'm making all these statements about how I don't know how much of the David story actually happened the way it's written down. But I still take a lot of comfort knowing that when I heard that he was 10 foot as a kid, that's probably not at least what was written down. It's a lot more accessible to me to think that he was 6'7". I can wrap my hands around that.
Well, if he was 10 foot and he was tending sheep, it would be very awkward for him to carry them around and service them at all, because 10 feet, sheep aren't that tall.
Well, this would have been Goliath, not
Oh.
David. Did I say David? If I
Yeah,
did,
so I said
I messed up.
David.
No, David was not that tall.
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say that, but
They have found skeletons fairly recently that were 9 and 10 feet tall, which makes you really wonder, okay, is this a hoax or is this?
right.
But it's scientifically,
I've seen that
Recorded.
more than once.
yes, I have also,
Yeah.
and from legitimate scientific sources,
Yeah.
so.
I mean, it's easier for me to kind of believe that there was a population where the average height was much taller than other populations.
I think Goliath was probably just an exception.
Exactly. And I think that's the part that's kind of important here, is that he wasn't
Because he was also, it seems like, thought of as a giant among his own people.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
It wasn't just the other ones. It wasn't just this huge group of giants coming towards them.
Yeah.
Which would be pretty darn intimidating.
Yeah, it was.
Well, it would be a completely different story. And we have myths about that kind of thing, where
We
there's,
do.
the attack of the giants and,
They have to come from somewhere.
and they have to come from somewhere, right? But this isn't that. This is, and of course, they keep on emphasizing that he's a boy, and then in what we read last week, they're saying, when you're looking for the or the future king to anoint, don't worry about the height, because it's not going to be the biggest, strongest person. So they're kind of setting, well, and then you see that in artistic renditions of David. Many of them, like Michelangelo's David is almost the exception in terms of how strong he looks. Most of the pictures of David have him as a pretty scrawny boy, to try to emphasize the contrast between David and Goliath.
That's always what I thought he was.
A scrawny boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought, growing up, I thought he was a kid.
I thought he was a young
Like an
man.
actual kid.
Yeah.
Like, I thought he was
Like a
19,
teenager.
20 or something. I never thought of him as that young when he reached this point.
I did, I think because Saul says something about how he's a child or something, the way that it's written.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and Saul's apparently really old here, kind of, as you said, a little bit wrong in his
It
head.
could have been dementia too, who knows?
Yeah, early onset.
Well, and we won't have time to read all of it, but it
Yeah.
goes on and on and on about, Saul deciding to kill David kind of as a snap thing. There's multiple attempts on David's life. And then, usually after that, through the intersection of Jonathan often, which is Saul's son, who David loved, Saul regrets that he tried to kill David and repents. But you can buy that when it happens once. But when it happens over and over and over again,
But it's a king, and kings have to be paranoid, and the longer they're in power, the more paranoid they get, the fewer people they can trust, and the more they're seeing assassins all around them.
there's certainly an element to that. But, again, we'll look at a couple of them just to get a taste of it, It really does feel like Saul snaps. That it is not this long premeditated thing, that he has these instant moments where it's like somebody flips a switch and now he's gonna have to kill this guy.
See, I can totally believe that, because if David's been anointed, Saul is looking at David as like, you want my throne.
But he doesn't know that.
Saul didn't know?
He didn't know that he was
He knew
anointed.
He was anointed.
He got the picture later on, and Samuel kind of told him later on.
Yeah,
But not the first few times that he snaps at him.
oh, okay.
He had no idea. He was definitely not a part of the anointing.
I really need to reread this.
Go back and do the first one.
Man.
Any other thoughts or questions? I don't want to keep you here all day. So, what's scheduled for next time is to kind of make David king and talk a little bit, the Bathsheba story, we can't miss that.
Can't ignore.
Yeah.
And go, I would love to talk about David and Jonathan, because that is really interesting. That might be what has to kind of fall to the side a little bit,
Side.
which is too bad. But
Yeah, that's okay. It's like,
so anyway, thank you for coming, and hope you'll come next time.
thank you very much.
Yeah, hopefully we'll-
Some really nice things to remember. Good points.
Thank you.
So is this just every week after church?
Yeah, so we do 2 more weeks of this topic,
Okay.
but we always try to have adult education classes going on, and they're very different. This is more of a Bible study.
Yes.
My wife is doing one out there, just by chance, she's teaching that one, and, it's about language in the Bible. She's a linguist.
Oh.
So she's kind of bringing in her expertise to
That's
talk
cool.
about the Bible and translation. Some of the stuff we talked about today, ironically.
Yeah.
And then later on, we have a class that's kind of aimed for people who either didn't grow up Lutheran or kind of want. You didn't. Well, you might be interested in this. I'm doing this with Steve, so 2 of us are doing that. I think in January.
Okay.
So just kind of talking about why we do what we do, and how we're different from other folks.
Pour coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
Always pour coffee.
Lutherans, the first thing you learn as a child is how to pour coffee. I
Oh,
swear.
interesting.
Yes, we are the best